Good morning. I'm going to call the meeting to order. Could we have the roll call?
Lorraine Koss.
Here.
Charlie Venuto.
Present.
Vinnie Taranto.
Here.
John Windsor.
Here.
Terry Casto.
He's sick.
Oh, yes, he's asked to be excused. David Lane.
Here. Karen
McLaughlin. Here. Stephanie Ely.
Here.
John Gerke.
Here.
Courtney Barker. Here. Todd Swingle. Danielle Bowden. We have a quorum.
Would you all please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I will entertain a motion for approval of the agenda.
So moved. Second.
Is there any discussion?
Yeah, should we add a new business item to be able to respond to what the commission sent back? Do we add that as new business on the agenda, or just address it generally anywhere in the agenda?
I think Virginia had a plan to address that.
I was going to let you address that under your comments at the end. I'm sure there'll be public comment as well, so if you want to hear the public comment first.
But were you planning to have it as a formal agenda item for the March meeting?
In March.
Okay.
Yes, definitely formal. I was going to get to that in my report, but
Okay.
In March.
Hearing none, all those in favor
After the
signify by
commission
saying aye.
meeting, isn't it?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. I'll also entertain a motion for approval of the minutes.
So moved.
Second.
Is there any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Virginia.
okay, thank you. So the 2019 plan update that you recommended in your previous meeting went to the County Commission on Tuesday the 12th. There was not approval to adopt it as proposed, and so they've sent that back to you as a committee with some specific requests. We'll be working on pulling that information together for your consideration at your March meeting. But if you have any guidance today for what you might like staff to pull together or how you might like us to present the data, present information to you, you can give that to us today, or you can call us or email us with those requests. Next week we will be dedicated to this for the next month. So,
Virginia, will there be group discussion on that today?
The agenda is yours. So I believe that there will likely be public comment on that today, and you may want to respond to that public comment. You may want to speak about that amongst yourselves today. But we're not really prepared to help you respond today. We need time to prepare.
Courtney.
I would just make a recommendation to put that on the agenda under general public comment, like right after that, and then so we could give our comments to the staff so they understand where we're coming from before they get to work, and addressing both. I mean, they're in the unique position of having to address two different groups, and so we want to make sure they have enough information to do that by the next meeting. I think would be good.
And we will have, that is on the agenda, final comments by chair and committee members.
So you want to do it under that?
So I think it's appropriate to do it under
Okay,
that.
that's fine.
All right.
All right. Also on Tuesday evening, we took the revised committee recommendation for education outreach and public engagement to the board. They approved moving forward with the contracts with the selected contractors, and authorized expenditure of the grass clipping campaign, but not expenditure on the other campaigns. The board asked for 4 weeks for them to gather more information on what outreach programs are already out there, because they indicated they did not want to be duplicative. So I don't know what they're going to come up with, but they've sort of taken the ball with that and said they would bring back something in 4 weeks. Vacancies on the Oversight Committee. We received 11 applications for the 4 vacant seats. The League of Cities made their selections, and I had, where did those handouts go? Take one and pass them. So for the real estate alternate position, the League of Cities ranked Dennis Basil as their number 1 candidate. He was also qualified for the technology member seat that the county commission gets to select. So if the county commission were to select him for a member seat instead of an alternate seat, the League of Cities provided a second ranked person, Jay Moynihan. For tourism, the alternate seat to be filled by the League of Cities, they've selected Laura Lee Thompson. And then for the technology seat, one of the options for the county commission is to promote the current alternate, Vinnie Toronto, from the alternate seat to the member seat. If they did that, the alternate seat would then be vacant. So in case that occurred, we asked the League of Cities to go ahead and select who their candidate would be for the technology alternate seat, and they selected John Lusner. So the county commission decision on their seats, as well as appointing the league selections, that is scheduled to go to the county commission on the 26th, February 26th. And so we should have new members seated in March, and that will make the March discussion of the plan update interesting. And we will also want to do a little refresher, and for them, perhaps the first time, brief on sunshine law, to make sure they don't get in trouble before they get started. So we all remember how important that is, and so we'll spend a little bit of time in March on that, and then we'll dig into the plan update. And unless you direct otherwise, I probably will not schedule anything else for that meeting, because that's the priority. Okay. So Penwood Septic to Sewer in Melbourne, the extension of the sewer line is complete, and now they're working on hooking up the individual homes. At the beaches, leaking sewer lateral, the contract for groundwater monitoring has been issued. We've sent notices to the owners of the 30 leaky laterals, and we've already gotten replies from 3 of them that they want in on the program, and they're willing to have monitoring done on their properties, and so that is finally moving forward.
So are we going to repair those 30, or are we just going to monitor?
We are going to monitor, repair, and continue monitoring to measure the change in groundwater.
Thank you.
So we have determined that they are compromised. We know that groundwater can get in when they're submerged.
Yes.
Part of what we're going to monitor is to make a better determination of how much is getting out.
Whether sewage gets
So that
out
we
and
can
how much.
do a better evaluation of the true impact of those improvements. Awesome, that's very good.
Yeah, the impact of the potential of them leaking out and polluting the groundwater, as well as we know the potential
Great.
of them leaking in and causing sewage overflows
Sure.
to the lagoon. The Grand Canal muck dredging project is out for bid, with a bid opening scheduled for March 12th. The O'Galley muck dredging project, we have our state permits. We were thinking we were going to get federal permits just before the shutdown. So now we're hoping they dig their way out from under the backlog and get us those permits shortly. Meanwhile, bid document preparation is underway. The Bettinger Oyster Reef was constructed, and initial monitoring was completed by the University of Central Florida Oyster Research Team. We've received a grant to remove 7 derelict vessels. That work will begin on Monday, and Matt Culver is also meeting with the Florida Inland Navigation District tomorrow on another grant that we have had very good success in getting those dollars. So Matt's expecting we'll probably end up with enough funding to keep this contractor working, pulling out 12, 13 or more vessels starting on Monday.
Virginia, does it fall under MAT or FWC? There's a number of vessels that are being full-time lived upon that are out in the rivers, okay, and that are dumping raw sewage directly into the river in violation of every frickin' law I can think of. Who would be actually in charge of enforcing this? Matt, you're here, so maybe you can answer.
It's FWC, but I'll let Matt come on up and provide more information. I'm going to walk through those.
Sure, the process. So I missed the beginning of your question. I apologize.
That's all right, Matt. There are a number of vessels that have moved, for example, from a recently closed marina that are in anchorage in the river, okay, and they are dumping raw sewage into the river from their holding tanks. Who would enforce that illegal activity?
FWC will enforce that, and actually, I can tell you I spoke with the Sheriff's Department yesterday, and FWC and the Sheriff have been doing sweeps on these vessels over the past few days, and they plan to do it into this week. They're dropping dye tabs into these vessels to make sure they're not.
So we probably shouldn't have talked about that today.
That's all right. Let them know.
And they actually, so they're doing that same area, and they did find a couple of violations, and that was just at the beginning of their sweep, so they're continuing that work now.
Thank you.
Sure thing.
Thanks, Matt. All right, some of you may be aware that the County Commission directed staff to contract to place 4 continuous water quality monitoring stations in the lagoon. We were already working with Orca to contract to install 2 of those systems at the entrance canals for the Grand Canal system so that we could measure the impact of removing that muck, the improvement to water quality as a result of removing that muck before and after that project. So we're looking at what is the best place to locate those additional 2 stations to monitor water quality in the lagoon. Our respond funds have mostly been directed towards measuring the performance of specific projects, but of course we also want all of those projects to add up to improvement in the lagoon. So these stations will help us address that question as well.
Virginia, what are the costs for those additional units?
The units were the cost to construct the units and purchase all the pieces parts was funded by the legislature several years ago. They were installed in the lagoon, and the maintenance costs were funded by the legislature for several years, and then that funding was reduced. And so about a dozen of these systems were removed a year or so back because there wasn't funding for maintaining them. Maintaining them requires going out monthly, scrubbing the marine things that happen out there, as well as changing out. There's wet lab chemistry in these monitoring devices that has to be replaced on a monthly basis. So the county's cost will just be the $30,000 a year maintenance per system, plus whatever, up to $1,500 or so to install them on pilings in the lagoon.
And that'll be paid for by the lagoon funds?
It'll be paid for out of the respond money that is for measuring the progress of the plan.
Good.
John?
I just wanted to point out, the units, I think they're about $30,000 apiece. There's 4 of them, and the contract is up to an additional 3 years, so nearly $500,000 for this expenditure. It never came to the committee for review for that specific application. I expressed some concerns when I saw it on the agenda, and I was told that it fits within the respond category, and it was done all legally and above the board. But I think it's important to know that you didn't have a chance to review that specific project for nearly $500,000.
Courtney?
Yeah, I had the same concerns, but I thought, it's a good thing, right? I mean, we all want to see the monitoring happen, so I didn't go speak on that issue because of that reason, because I thought, yes, it didn't come through the committee, but I didn't have a problem with it. I thought, it was a good idea to, continue our monitoring. And that's one thing that we always have a hard time convincing the public, is that we need to do these types of things so we can make sure that we're, guiding our science the right way. So, to have a county commissioner support that was a good thing in my opinion. So that's why I wanted to, just put that out there.
Help me with the math. It's about 30, it used to be like 25, so it's $25,000-$30,000 a year for maintenance on an Orca monitor, which I think is cheap. Times 4 is $120 a year. Where's the $500,000 come from?
That's a year, that's
It's the first year.
for a year, and then up to 3 additional, it's per year.
Okay, so it's not a $500,000 this year out of the restore budget. It's a $500,000 over a period of 4 years
Right,
or
and
something.
that's the way the commission looks at
Okay.
budgets. They look over long periods of time often.
Well, we all do.
So let me just back up a bullet. I don't know how I skipped this one. The second quarterly groundwater monitoring report came in, and I meant to send this to you. Let me send this report to you. We placed 45 groundwater monitoring wells in communities all around the county. And so we have over 6 months of data from those wells, in addition to the year of data that we have from our Turkey Creek pilot project site that helped inform how to set up this larger countywide groundwater monitoring study. And both of those reports are showing a very strong signal for nitrate, NOx from the reuse water. So in areas that are on sewer and do not have reuse water, that groundwater is cleaner than areas on septic. But in areas with sewer and reuse, the nitrate level is nearly the same, nearly equivalent to the septic areas. And so that's not a sampling of every reclaimed water plant out there. There's only 4, and 2 of those 4 we knew from the plant data that they were putting out fairly high rates, but it does indicate that for those plants that are putting out high concentrations in their reclaimed water, that this is a concern to our groundwater.
So that just kind of reiterates the projects that we have in there for reuse. It kind of supports that, validates and supports that.
Yes.
Question then, and the other piece that we don't know is that reuse water, reclaimed water, being used correctly in those neighborhoods. I know in my neighborhood, it's way overused. And if people were only educated in regard to how often they should be watering and the maximum results, we could be beneficially using our reclaimed water, because ultimately we need to do that.
Yes, Todd?
Just a comment on education on reuse. I've never seen it work. People set their irrigations, and they're going to set their irrigation and use what they use. Rates work.
Yep.
Application of the same conservation-based rates that are used in potable water to reclaim works very well. At a prior utility that I managed, I saw average consumption on reclaim go from over 20,000 gallons a month per resident to under 10,000 with simply implementing conservation-based rates. So that's an additional comment that while there are certainly many capital things that we can do to improve the quality of the reclaim output that's coming out of the wastewater plants, and I think those are certainly a very good use of our funds. Those aren't quick. A major capital project on a wastewater plant is probably 3 years if you're lucky, and probably more like 5. If we want to look at administrative type controls, and that's a place that right now hasn't necessarily been as much our focus, but it is certainly connected to the outcomes of everything we do. And I think as we come back to the commission with recommendations, we need to seriously consider how those policy-related matters connect to the success of the dollar investments that we're making. And I don't know that's a place that we were hesitant to go in the first year or two, and we said was outside of our scope. It is, but I don't know how that they are not mutually exclusive.
Can I ask a question? So what, you're saying that we would affect the policy decisions that the utility would charge? Is that what you're suggesting?
Ultimately, the county commission is over the county utility, and other governments. I do believe there's a significant education component to those utilities. So to be able to talk to the utilities to say, you know, I know historically you have not had a reclaim conservation rate in place, letting them know what the benefits of that can be. That being said, there are challenges to that as well, because it is wastewater. Every one of you probably generated some wastewater this morning. It has to go somewhere. It used to go directly into the water bodies. It's now going into use for reclaim, which does have a productive benefit. It's better than it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago. We should never forget that. It has made progress. Does it need to make more progress? Absolutely. But they also have to manage this wastewater. They have to manage their effluent too. I think Cocoa Beach is one of the examples that's done a really good job. They've put in a deep well so that they have the ability to, if their customers don't use enough reclaim, that they have the ability to have a disposal source that gets rid of it without it going, overflowing or going to surface water bodies. But it's those types of contingencies they have to have in place because it comes every day. You know, it just does. And you got to be able to manage it. So these are not simple solutions. And when you do add rates and you get people applying it more effectively to their yards, that means the wastewater plant still has to manage that amount that's not being used. And there's two ways of doing that. That's either grow the amount of your customers or find another place to put it. Neither of those happen overnight. But those types of complexities are very closely linked to all of these things that we're talking about.
I was just going to, I think the policy option, I think that's another option. I think it's great. I know education and I don't know, never worked. I hear what you're saying, and I think for years they put labels on cigarettes saying the Surgeon General warns you it's going to kill you, and people kept buying them until the right campaign came about. So, but I think that's another tool in the toolbox, education and policy, like you said, Todd.
Yeah, I'm not opposed to education, and I always think that the more that we can have people connected to our cause, if nothing else, just for support and buy-in, is absolutely worthwhile. I just, if we want to see results, and by the discussions that are going on, and clearly, and the public sentiment, and what every one of us wants to see, is we want to see results as soon as possible. I think we're remiss if we think those education results are going to get there. That being said, those investing now in education is very worthwhile, so that 10 and 15 and 20 years from now, we start to see a sustained progress and sustained implementation of the things that are getting started today. I would argue with you on a lot of the cigarettes that it didn't necessarily change behavior, but we significantly influenced the thought processes of a new generation of people that finally grew up to be the age that would have been your smokers and grew up with that messaging, and because of that, never developed that thought process.
And I would argue thought processes lead to behavior, but we can have that. We can have that outside.
Not to beat a dead horse here, but just one point that, at least for cocoa, to raise those rates, that's going to go before your council, and I can tell you the room will be full with people that are fighting against any rate raise unless they understand why it's happening.
Completely understand, and that's the challenge we face. Even when the commission debated the septic moratorium, which wasn't really a moratorium, it was basically a mandate to provide higher level treatment septics within a certain distance of the river. There was a big cost discussion over, the $5,000 or $10,000 for a upgraded septic for close to the river, okay? But yet, we're spending $20,000 in tax dollars to convert septic. So these aren't, I agree with you, they're not simple answers, but we're also remiss if we don't get them out front and center and be transparent about them so that we're making logical, educated, database choices at every level of government that affects the lagoon.
Yes, Sean.
Virginia, last February, I believe it was, a year ago, we had preliminary reports from the Rockledge Breeze Swept project, which were very encouraging for all of us. It's been a year. I haven't seen any updates since we're talking about monitoring. Does it continue to demonstrate the significant drop in human pollution into groundwater after we got rid of the septic tanks?
I have not seen those reports. Rockledge wanted to get the final report before they gave it to us, so I'll...
Can you bring it forward for, yeah. I mean, if it proves, if it continues to prove that this system works, our focus of removing septic tanks that are near the river needs to be continued.
Can I just add one more thing on the rate? It is very important in those rates. It is not a revenue grab. It is not something to get additional money. And these rates are typically structured where there are multiple tiers. Many utilities have been successful in lowering those first level tiers so that when you're using an amount that is appropriate for what your need is, that you keep those costs very low. And it's only when you start to use above the amount that is necessary. In fact, the utility that I manage, I'm very proud of the program they've put in place because it goes as far as to look at property size and to say, here's the amount that you should effectively use. And the rates are very well controlled up to that amount. And then above that, it is a conservation-based rate that you see that in that increasing cost if you're using over the amount that is needed for your use. Because, again, reclaim used at the appropriate levels is a very, very positive thing. So there's a lot more complexity even in rate design. I do think it's important that it's not intended to be just a revenue increase and getting additional money. It's intended to show that signal when it's overused, only when it's overused.
Yeah. You know, cocoa rates are very low on reclaimed, and that's for 200,000 customers, so you're starting there.
Most of which runs right down into the Indian River.
The results showed that it was actually pretty good. Relatively speaking, it had low nitrogen levels as compared to the others. Because they invested in the stormwater systems and mixing it with stormwater.
Virginia.
So the last thing under work completed this month is the contract with the Water Management District for the M1 Canal rediversion project, and we've had multiple discussions with them about the design of that project. So that will be another, large improvement like the Turkey Creek C1 rediversion project, moving water west to the St. Johns River where it used to go before we ditched and canaled and redirected it improperly to the lagoon. On work underway this month, yes.
Because I'm not saying completed. So dealing with the state, trying to get permits for oysters in the banana because somebody up there doesn't believe they were actually oysters there. Any progress? I mean, I know a lot of volunteers have helped and staff spent a bunch of time.
Right. We had a agency meeting, it was on here somewhere, near the bottom of work underway this month, 3 up from the bottom, on site selection and success criteria, and FWC staff brought in a couple oyster research experts from Chesapeake and Florida, and to help us come up with success criteria and site suitability selection criteria that the agencies that we can then say, here are the criteria that we're going to use for site selection, and here's where we vetted these sites for these criteria, and provide all of that information in our permit request. So we're making headway. It's slow trying to pick those numbers that are appropriate for Brevard, because the state and nobody else collected data on the historical reefs here, and what those metrics were. What was a healthy reef? What was the density? What was the size? What was the abundance? What was the height off the bottom? What were the sediments like? What was the water quality like? We don't have that information, and so we're having to use information from other places and try to convince the agencies that that's appropriate for Brevard. It's the best surrogate we have. So it remains a challenge, but we're chipping away at it.
Okay, so while you've got people from the Chesapeake and all down here, and FWC's in the room, ask them why we can't buy spat out of Maryland and Virginia, where it is incredibly inexpensive, okay? We can't even buy it from the west coast of Florida because of their stupid rules. We could bring down all we need and save thousands, tens of thousands of dollars if they would allow us to bring it in. And I don't want to read the genetic report before, again, I've read it and it's wrong, or it's insignificant. Good luck. And thanks to all the fishermen and volunteers out in the community that have been giving Virginia staff lat-long numbers where reefs existed 20 and 30 and 40 years ago and are still there today, so we can demonstrate it actually exists.
Thank you. So since you brought that up, on the back side of your sheet, under upcoming Lagoon Science Forums and public events, the University of Central Florida is holding an Indian River Lagoon History Harvest at Field Manor on February 24th, and they are also looking to gather up all of those histories and old documentation, photos, postcards, whatever people have on oysters and other wildlife, marine life of the lagoon. But we're want to make sure people know about that history harvest, because that historical knowledge is hard to find, and it's disappearing rapidly. So back to work underway this month. The County Commission was asked on Tuesday night to consider extending 3 Melbourne projects, just a time extension due to delays with those projects. And the Commission did approve those extensions, but they also made it clear that their priority is that projects move forward swiftly. And so they wanted a lot of information about why those time extensions were happening. And so just to let everybody know that the focus is on, moving projects along. And Melbourne responded wonderfully, and they're actually staffing up to try to move. What they said was they, bit off probably more than they could chew in that first round of project applications, and now they're investing and staffing up to move these projects and additional projects along. So we appreciate their efforts. We have multiple county septic sewer projects moving through design, with the Utility Services Department working on those design reviews for us, providing their expertise. Mullet Creek, running way down the list, Mullet Creek muck dredging, we received a design proposal. Given the board's direction to reduce expenditure on muck, we're sitting on that proposal because we don't want to move forward and spend money on a project that might get the funding cut for it. So just so you know, staff is holding off on exercising that at the moment. And I think that's it for that I wanted to highlight on that side of the sheet. The presentations this month, the first meeting, that February 6th, NASA DEP partnership meeting, that was postponed due to the federal shutdown. The Harbor Branch symposium was a wonderful event as usual, and I was hoping to grab at least one of the presentations from that event and bring it to you in March, but we'll now postpone that probably till April. And then I just want to highlight the Florida Tech and the Brevard Indian River Lagoon Coalition is holding this public forum at Gleason Auditorium on February 26th. You have the little half-sheet handout, straight talk, sewage system, septic, and muck in our lagoon. And people can register at the Eventbrite seat. I'm not sure what the capacity of that room is, but I understand there are over 250 people have registered already. So if you're interested, you need to register. They may be full.
And the capacity is 450.
Capacity is 450. Thank you. That's it for my report.
Thank you. All right. Robert? Musser?
Yeah. Bob?
Fiscal reports, wasn't that before?
So Bob Musser's the Port Environmental Director. They've taken, we've talked about this a little in the past, the Port's taken an active role in looking at the circulation in the Indian River Lagoon and the possible impacts of causeways, especially 520 and 528, on natural circulation in the lagoon. And that has created some action lately, and so Bob Musser's here to give us the latest, which includes meetings yesterday.
Correct. Thank you, and excuse my voice. My daughter, 8-year-old daughter's learning to share, so she shared a nice cold with my wife and I for Valentine's Day. We were feeding each other chicken soup last night. But Virginia asked me to give an update on this. I believe most of you, there's some new faces here, but back in, was it November 18th, Dr. Zarillo gave a presentation to the committee on the study that we funded. Couple quick things I wanted to mention. One is, why is the port interested in this? We are the property owner from the middle of the Indian River Lagoon all the way to the port of State Road 528. We also have a very good working relationship, intermodal logistics with DOT, lots of partnerships on funding on projects that have been done out at the port. I wanted to give you a little bit of history of how we ended up here. It's actually almost 2 years ago. DOT on the project came out with their environmental look-around. It was March 8th, 2017. There were many agencies that were there, including Brevard County, the NEP, the port, and many other citizens had said, at this environmental look-around, why can't, hey DOT, can you look at this? What would be the effects of elevating the causeways on flushing? We held a meeting at the port on October 17th, October 2017, with the port. TPO was there, NEP, and we had a presentation at that time from Dr. Zarillo on some of the flushing projects he's done and his thoughts about potentially doing that with this. We kind of hooked up DOT with Dr. Zarillo and expected them to kind of work together on putting together a project. DOT came back with us in December of 17 and had essentially done a literature review of what's out there. Some old studies, some dating back to 2003. I think one was a sedimentation study. Nothing really related to what we were looking at. So at that point, my senior management at the port elected to go forward. We did a partnership with the NEP, paid for 75% of the study. And what you have on the slide that's here are the model runs that came out of it. We looked at existing configurations and then 8 different modeling runs, different bridge spans, different areas, both in the IRL and in the Banana River. And I know I don't have to mention this to the committee. Banana River, one of the most impacted compartmentalized systems, and persistent algal blooms, one of the poorest areas of water quality in the lagoon. The results of that, and I put these up front here, essentially say that we could get a 9 to 10% improvement in flushing. And I want to remind you, this was just a circulation flushing model. This was not a water quality model. That can be done separately. Virginia mentioned that there's been, the reason for this update is after this was presented to my Port Commission on October 31st, they instructed staff to come back with a resolution. That resolution was unanimously passed by the Port Commission on December 5th, and I think that's included in your package, and I'll mention that in a minute. Last Friday, the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program Board also voted unanimously to essentially piggyback on the resolution. That came up through the STEM committee and the management board. That I'm actually on the port rep for that on the management board, and that should be, I think they're working on getting signatures, very similar to what the port had put out. The main model run that we focused on was Model Run 3, and these have spans within 528 and 520, which are shown there in the red at the top and the yellow at the bottom. And I zoomed in on this because you can actually see the grid cells. This is how the model runs, and you'll see this in the next slide. It moves water across those grid cells that are about 25 to 50 meters across, and that's how it shows the flow. I'm hanging in there. The results of that, and this will be difficult to see on this high-quality monitor here, but that is the existing conditions. And this is after the model run ran for about 320 days. And this is the conditions, I'm sorry, that's existing conditions. To the right is after the model run. So it's difficult to see, but if you do notice, there is more yellow. Basically, the warmer the color, the blues are more circulation occurring in the area. Down, the flow is coming, of course, and through Sebastian Inlet. A lot of the bridges in the southern IRL do have very large spans already on them. When you get up into the central part, you start to get more and more filled causeways that start to restrict flow, which is actually exactly what happens with State Road 528 and 520. I want to get to the results, and I believe Dr. Zerillo showed this when he presented this, but the reason why we focused on Model Run 3, you'll see Model Run 3 and 4 have very similar results. There is a little bit more increase on Model Run 4 for Station 4 or 5. I don't know if you can see that Station 4 and 5 are over in the IRL. There's a cell above State Road 528, and then the one between 520 and 528. But we focused on Model Run 3 basically because there is a lot of existing infrastructure over on State Road 520. The costs for this, and DOT did a very high-level cost estimate that they just presented this week, which I'll get to in a moment, but the costs significantly go up for doing the span for Model Run 4 compared to 3. And I'll mention this real quick. Their estimated cost per construction for Model Run 3 is $662 million. That is for elevating the bridges. To add the additional bridges to Model Run 4, which would include the IRL and 520 and 528, that goes up to an additional $315 million above their estimated cost estimate of $790. Just to do Model Run 3, their cost estimate, and it's a very high level again, was $187 million. So 662 plus an additional $187 million to do those two long span bridges in the Banana River of 520 and 528. Again, very high level in today's dollars. 520 is not currently programmed for study other than dusting off a 10-year-old study that looked at the potential flood impacts of 520. That's the TPO is going to be doing that. Transportation Planning Organization is going to be looking at that soon. I guess just to remind everybody, Hurricane Irma almost it did almost overwash 520. It about came across halfway across 528, right near the port. And one of the things that I've seen from some of the footage up in the Panhandle from the hurricane damage up there, built structures, man-made structures, causeways, did not fare well. If you had an elevated bridge, for most of the areas, the bridge is still there. The approach, the earthen approach may be gone, but that's something very easy to fix, but the bridge is still there. That's something to consider. A lot of folks have asked, what does 10% get you? And if you look at Model Run 3, in the second compartment, you're getting a 9.3% increase, almost 10% increase in flushing. Is this going to fix the algal blooms and take care of that just on this project alone? No. But if you couple it with a lot of the projects that you all are working on, wastewater improvements, stormwater improvements, muck removal, and you have also increased circulation, we think it makes sense to take a look at this. And that's what our resolution did. It's basically very benign, and I'll read this real quick. It goes through the importance of the lagoon or the bridges, mostly for hurricane evacuation. And it says, support DOT's efforts to study and evaluate infrastructure improvement options to 528 and 520. Encourage the inclusion of any and all infrastructure improvements that will benefit the lagoon, the economy, and the resiliency of essential transportation corridors and infrastructure. Excuse me. I think the resiliency part is key, especially what we've seen from the hurricane impacts. Raising that bridge up, evaluating the potential for future water level rise is something that really needs to be considered. So with that, as I mentioned, Virginia asked me to come here. You have a copy of the resolution. If this is something that the committee is interested in potentially coming up with their own and submitting to the county commission, certainly that's your decision. That's something that we're promoting. As I mentioned, the NEP did just approve it last Friday. The Transportation Planning Organization Board will be bringing a similar resolution back from they had their meeting yesterday. That should be coming back to the board at the March meeting, I believe. So this was just put out there for your consideration, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Robert?
Yes, sir.
You mentioned Model 3 is the model you focused on. You kind of glossed over exactly what you were doing there. I heard you say another bridge, but...
Model Run 3, and I'll go back.
What exactly are you doing to the causeway?
We are elevating... I'm sorry if I didn't explain that properly, but essentially we're taking out the earthen fills areas and we're elevating and putting an elevated bridge.
So on that graph where it's red,
yes,
that entire area would become a span.
The filled causeway would come out. A side benefit is you're now opening up benthic area for potential seagrass growth as well. One of the things I wanted to mention is Tampa Bay just constructed. Tampa Bay has really rebounded on their seagrass. They're meeting their goals for their estuary program. And they just finished construction on a elevated bridge span over Courtney Campbell Causeway, State Road 60. And I say causeway because that's pretty much what that is. It had some of the poorest water quality in the north regions of the bay. They were able to offset the impacts not only for putting that elevated causeway in on State Road 60, but also plan future changes to the main artery between St. Pete and Tampa on the Howard Franklin. On the western side of Tampa Bay towards Pinellas County is mostly earthen causeway. During storm events that has overwashed, so they're looking at elevating that. So that one project on State Road 60 is allowing them to bank mitigation credits for seagrass creation that are expected to come from that State Road 60 project.
Court.
Did that answer your question?
Partially.
I'm looking at the yellow line down on 520, but what you're talking about is doing it up on 528?
Well, they're mutually exclusive, and that's something I should have mentioned.
Both?
You have to do both to get the benefit. If you just do 520, and I'll go to the next one, if you just do 528, which is the model run 2, you don't get a lot of benefit.
Right.
You get very little benefit. You need both.
Okay.
And both of them is what gets the circulation moving. And I apologize, I got medicine head, so I apologize I didn't mention that. But.
Courtney?
I just have questions, and I don't think this study could answer it, but the idea of using the word flushing bothers me, I think, only because when you say that, and when we call it that, it brings to mind that you're going to, like a toilet, like the pollution's just going to somehow disappear out of the lagoon, and we're not going to see it again. And I just have to, from a nutrient biological standpoint, what exactly does increased circulation do? Does it make it go away? Does the pollution somehow leave the lagoon? I mean, that's the question that I'm struggling with. That's one. And then the second one, and I think it leads into that question needs to be answered, I think, before we go to DOT and say, reconstruct a bridge. That is no easy task. That's a big deal, and I haven't seen those studies. Maybe they exist, but I haven't seen them. I think 520 is a no-brainer because of the resiliency issue. I mean, we all saw what happened during Irma. And so I think from that standpoint, but for 528, to ask DOT to do something that extensive, I would have to see some more data that shows such a benefit from a pollution standpoint. I mean, I understand the logic of wanting to see movement, but I don't understand what it does to clean the lagoon.
If I can mention two quick things on that. One, I'd encourage everybody to go to the Port's website. If you go to our stewardship page, not only does it have Dr. Zerillo's report that he presented back in November, it also has the other detailed models that he did, and one is this drogue study that actually looks at particle movement. I am not a modeling expert, but when you look at that and you start seeing how it kind of bounces around, you get a better understanding on and it's really you're correct. It's really circulation, not so much flushing, and getting the water moving. As you all know, this is a wind system, and you're getting this is a tidal pulling the tidal water up from Sebastian and going through these causeway openings to start getting it moving around. So I would recommend you take a look at that. Visually, I look at things more visually, and that really gives me a better idea. It has all the runs are in there, both for the flushing like that, and also that drogue study, and that may help. But
I don't think you've really answered her question. We understand that opening these causeways is going to improve circulation.
Right.
What's the benefit of improved circulation to the pollution in the lagoon?
The benefit, I think, is like I mentioned, is going to be coupled with everything else we're doing. So you reduce nutrients, you reduce wastewater, you reduce inflows, and you get things moving around. It's a part of the puzzle, so to speak. And I think there are water quality models that can be done. This was the first step to look at the circulation portion of it. But I also want to mention, this right now, the 528 study is replacing every bridge except the existing westbound bridge on 528 that goes over the Indian River Lagoon. So every other bridge, all the existing circulation bridges are being replaced. This would essentially do a span from when you get to the east side of Merritt Island, Banana River Drive, pretty much all the way over to the port would open that up. And this is something that's going to be there probably well past my lifetime. 30 to 50 years is the lifespan for this bridge. So it's something to consider. Do we look at this now? Do we study it more? What are the cost benefits to it? DOT has started looking at that. They actually hired a consultant to review Dr. Zerillo's report I have I think it's a 12-page memo that they submitted with questions on that he's currently reviewing, and we're going to respond back to that. But they did fund that. So it's got a lot of moving parts, but again, I think the key is what do we want to see and what do we want to have out here in 30 to 50 years? Because if we miss this opportunity, then
We miss.
And just real quick, your hand was up first, but because what's really driving your study is that 528, they're
Correct.
redoing it. So
That's currently in the design
520
phase,
may
yes.
be the best place to start, but 528 is what's on the books right now.
correct.
It
So-
just says to study and evaluate, so I guess, I mean, if they do that and they say, okay.
It comes down to cost, as the TPO executive director mentioned yesterday. This an increased cost for elevating 528 is going to have ramifications to other projects. Personally, I think that when we get down the road of, does this make sense? Is this something we should look closer at? There may be other funding opportunities that could come together to help make this reality. I think that's a viable option down the road.
John?
So, Bob, thank you, and thank the port for finally getting FDOT's attention. Whether it goes anywhere, we don't know, but at least we're moving in the right direction. Flushing's the wrong word, circulation's the correct word. And to answer your question, Courtney, and we can do it right there at that 528 area, you have large areas on each side of the earthen banks, which are essentially dead zones. There's no fish, there's no grass, etc. And you can look at historical pictures of the Banana and the Indian prior to the installation of all of these causeways. And the water moves north and south seasonally, driven by wind. And as you put these earthen dams in, essentially, you create eddies and dead areas where there's no grass growing, etc. So if you can accomplish this, along with everything else that we're doing, the likelihood of grass and sea life.
Okay, so that's the benefit then?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Understood.
So then are you, Bob, looking for some sort of response from this committee that then you can take to FDOT along with the others, or to the county?
That would be, your decision whether you would like to support a similar resolution. Like I said, there are others that are in the works, and none of them are saying to DOT, thou shalt do this. It's look at it, look at the feasibility, look at the costs, and then come back to us. That's all we're really looking for. I don't think it hurts for additional support. I know on the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program Board, that includes the 5 county areas, the 5 county commissioners, DEP, both water management districts, and the EPA, and they unanimously supported it. So that would be something for you all to consider.
Can I just one last question? Of course, we're concerned with the lagoon, but you also mentioned the resiliency, the storm protectedness that the elevation will help us with. Were the cost-benefit analysis, has the risk analysis been done on that? Any plans for that? Any
From TPO
opportunity
to
From
to
DOT?
take that into consideration when the commissioners consider this, not only the health of the lagoon, but our resiliency, our storm protectedness for the future, given the most conservative estimates for sea level rise?
I can't answer that. That would be a question for DOT. This is the first, just this week, this was the first we actually got their high-level estimates on what the increased cost would be. And, as I mentioned, elevating additional $187 million to elevate both 520 and 528, in my mind, and this is my personal opinion, doesn't sound like too bad of a deal. Certainly the doubling that, more than doubling that, to do the additional bridges in the Indian River Lagoon area. that would come up. But they are looking at, and I don't want to get into the details of the DOT study, because since it's theirs, they are looking at different alternatives to, reduce impacts, reduce nitrogen. They're looking at potential septic to sewer conversions, all sorts of different things in their environmental look around, from what they traditionally do to what they're proposing to do and looking at. So my understanding is they're currently in discussions with the Water Management District, the permitting agency, on what can and can't be done. So all of those things will play a role into not only your resiliency comment, but also additional benefits that could come out of this project.
I mean, would you, Virginia, want us to, if we wanted to, write up a resolution and then give it?
You could do a resolution, or you could just make a motion that we could carry to the county commission. I just want to add to some of the questions. So the modeling, and I'm not a modeler either, but my understanding of the modeling is that 9% of the water in that region that used to stay in that region would now make its way out to Sebastian Inlet, and there would be clean water there instead. So, that's a small fraction of reduction in residence time, but that's a replacement of that water, basically, with clean water. In addition to that, you have this movement of water that was certainly naturally there before and isn't there now. And some of these blooms like stagnant water. They do well in stagnant water. They don't do well in moving water. And so while I take your point about, has anybody done the water quality modeling to show what the potential impact of the circulation would be, I think that's a great question. But the biologists seem to think that this could have a significant impact on the ability of those blooms to get going and persist. Because if they're being moved and unhappy, then they just might not be able to keep going and going like they have been for the last 8 years.
And then coupled with everything else that's going on, too.
And this is just basically, we're supporting the evaluation and study of it. We're not saying...
Do it.
This is, do it. We're saying that this is a good enough idea, in theory, to go forward and look at the cost-benefit analysis and feasibility of it. So I would support doing that.
So would you like to make a motion?
I'll make a motion to support the resolution consideration of circulation improvements for State Roads 528 and 520 as provided by the Canaveral Port Authority.
Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
Is there any further discussion?
So just to be clear, the COC resolves to support FDOT's efforts to study and evaluate infrastructure improvements, Fully in favor.
All right. Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Beth Falls?
Get out of here.
Oh, sure. Get started. Thanks. Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
So I spoke to you earlier about the methods of our project, so I'm going to gloss over that so we can start talking about results. So I have about 15 minutes. I'm just going to hit some key points of our study. I will be providing a very detailed report that includes much more granular evaluation of our data, of which we have a lot of data, as well as some in-depth statistical analysis. But I just want to remind you of our goals for this project, and this is sort of one of the key things that we do at ORCA. So it's been evolving over the last 10 years, but our goals are to identify areas where pollution is accumulating and try to determine the source of pollution so that we can stop it at the source. So ORCA is a very collaborative organization. We work very hard to try to inform what all the many scientists and other organizations are doing in the Indian River Lagoon, as well as our work is informed by what other people are doing. So our projects and programs have evolved quite a bit over the last 10 years. So just to remind you of the study area that we're working in, I'm sorry somehow the identification of the bridges didn't make it into the handouts, but we collected sediment samples primarily, as well as groundwater samples and water quality in approximately 12 linear kilometers, but at 100 discrete sites in this study area. And so I'm just going to go over some of our maps that we have created from the data we gathered. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is muck. And I think our understanding of the importance of studying muck has really grown over time, identifying the fact that muck is not only a sink for pollution, but also a source of pollution, especially nutrients, has been very important to our work and has evolved to ORCA developing a number of methods to try to inform that, as well as to get to an understanding of where pollution is coming from independently of muck. But I just wanted to show how all of these, how complex this work is, and how all of these things that we're studying, all these parameters are very related to each other. So this is just a very simple statistical analysis, but just showing that how many of the things that we are studying, how they're highly correlated with muck depth. So the correlation coefficient, the closer that is to 1, the more highly it's correlated. And then statistical significance, just the smaller that number is, the less the likelihood is that the relationship is by chance. So it shows that muck is highly correlated to many of the things that we're concerned about as far as pollution in the Indian River Lagoon. And so interestingly, we've gotten used to seeing some pretty bright red muck maps. And so this was actually relatively less mucky than other portions of the lagoon. And so what we originally planned to do with these maps is identify hotspots, because when you can identify, like you can see on this map, there's clear areas where muck is accumulating. It's much easier to go in and try to solve that problem. So I think with this particular muck map, I think digging in and trying to see what's causing those particular hotspots of muck is going to be an actionable outcome of the study. So the next thing I want to briefly talk about is the toxicity. So just to remind you, when we measure toxicity, we're measuring relative toxicity. So it's a very broad spectrum test. It doesn't tell us what the particular toxin is, and it doesn't even tell you the absolute toxin or amount of toxicity. It just says relative to all of the other sites, where are the areas that are most toxic. And we understand, because we use a biological assay, that there's some things that are going to impact that are natural in the environment. So again, our work on this has evolved over time, but what we think of this work as is sort of a triage, so we can go in when we see hotspots of toxicity and try to determine what the specific toxicants are, or natural toxins. And so Dr. Palmer is our partner on this project, so he's looking at these samples and digging in to see what are some of the specific anthropogenic toxins, as well as toxicants, as well as biological toxins. So he'll be presenting that information to you. But again, as our work has evolved, we're finding that toxicity is very highly correlated to a number of things. One of the questions we had very early on is, how do we know we're not just measuring hydrogen sulfide? And so we've dug into that a little bit, and this map that I just pulled up is our total sulfur. And there is a high correlation between toxicity and sulfur, but there's also a high correlation between sulfur and all these other parameters, as well as toxicity and many other parameters. So we have done some in-depth analysis, more in-depth statistical analysis that identifies, is there any particular parameters that explain the toxicity data more substantially than others? And nothing popped up. So everything is very highly related. So, and we kind of go back and forth on this because ultimately we want to dig down and find the specific one issue, but then on the other hand, because we are an applied organization, if it's all bad, then let's just, we kind of can take a more macroscopic picture or look at it and try to solve the problem on a larger scale. So again, there'll be very detailed information about this in the report, but I just wanted to talk about the sulfur because we have had that question a number of times. And additionally, we've done a number of in-laboratory tests of our samples where we've tested toxicity and then we've aerated our sample and tested it again to see and measured hydrogen sulfide and saw that when we reduce hydrogen sulfide, does that affect toxicity? And it does only in the samples that are the largest particle size, so the less silty samples, we see that probably hydrogen sulfide is impacting the toxicity more substantially and in the siltier, muckier stuff that we're mostly concerned about. I just wanted to bring this one map to your attention. We measured a number of heavy metals, but this map is copper. And this is something we had not seen in previous maps. We've seen in occasion some hot spots of copper, just one or two sites, but there was quite a bit of copper in this particular area that's incorporated into the sediment. So this is important because copper is toxic to invertebrates in the larval stage. So talking about bringing spat in and doing oyster farming and things like that, I think that this is another actionable outcome of this study is to try to get a handle on where this copper is coming from. So, and we have we'll include a bit of literature review. I don't know, we can have a discussion about that. We've had some success in the past identifying that, but I think that's something that we could work with you on or your team can look into. So I'm going to stop talking about toxicity because I know my time's limited, but I'd be happy to answer questions and move on to nutrients. So the nutrients in the sediment, this first map is total killed-all nitrogen, which is in the sediment, it's organic nitrogen plus ammonia. So you don't generally see nitrate and nitrite. For years we measured nitrate and nitrite, but we never saw any, and it was just a financial decision to stop measuring it. But I want to be clear that this is total killed-all nitrogen. So this is a measurement of ammonia and total organic nitrogen. And again, you can see some clear hot spots. If you look at that beside our ammonia map, it becomes a little bit interesting in that there's areas that are clearly organic nitrogen. So below 520, those red spots are very likely organic nitrogen because we're seeing high TKN but low ammonia. So we can look into that a little more in depth. And then if you add to that the phosphorus map, you can see, if you compare the one on the left to the one on the right, the TKN, the total killed-all nitrogen, is much higher. You have more red spots, but you have corresponding higher spots of the phosphorus. So this is one of the things that this is most likely going to be caused by is the brown tide that's been going on in that area for the last 2 years. And we do have a Kilroy in the bottom portion of this study area that has shown, I'll just go forward to that. This is a satellite image from NASA just showing the chlorophyll A in that area. But this, I'll go back. This is data from our Kilroy over the last 2 years. And so it's showing when we went out and took a sample, which was in March of 2018, that brown tide had a concentration of almost 3.5 million cells per milliliter. So a very dense bloom. And you can see, even though it's gone down substantially, maybe in half, it's still going on, and it's still a significant contribution to the nutrients that are getting into that area. So, like the gentleman said before, we have to look at these things together, because we're feeding this brown tide with nutrients that are then adding to the nutrient concentration of the muck, which is then being a source of more nutrients to the brown tide. So all of the projects working together, we need to figure out a way to stop feeding this bloom. Okay, so I'm talking very fast, so I'm going to have lots of time for questions. The next thing I just want to briefly talk to you about, when we talk about these nutrients, so brown tide is probably a significant source, especially in that lower area, but probably throughout the whole study area. The other thing that we and a lot of other people have been doing for a long time is trying to figure out how we can identify the source of these nutrients. And it's particularly looking for the anthropogenic sources. So one of the things that is being done, and that we did in this study, is look at sucralose and acetaminophen, two anthropogenic compounds that shouldn't be in the water. And so this is taken from an NEP study, but what I wanted to point out is that there is a significant difference in the half-life of sucralose and acetaminophen, and so you often see higher levels of sucralose relative to acetaminophen. So that's an important point, because this is exactly what we found in our study. And so in general, the reason we look at these two compounds together is because they help to distinguish. There's nothing absolute, but they help to distinguish the difference between septic and sewer. And so the reason for that is most of the acetaminophen is taken out through sewer treatment, whereas sucralose is not. And we have gotten a number of reuse samples of from different treatment plants. We've collected the effluent and measured sucralose and acetaminophen in those. And we've never found acetaminophen. We found incredibly large concentrations of sucralose. And so when you see just sucralose, that is a good indicator that it's going to be from reclaimed water irrigation. Whereas when you see them in balance, but remember, in balance, that means in the same ratio that you would expect, so in about a 1-to-10 ratio, then it's primarily going to be from untreated septic, yes. And so what we found, again, which is very different than we found in other areas of the lagoon, is that we did find, in fact, high levels of both sucralose and acetamin throughout the study area, pretty much spread throughout. And we were provided this map that shows the septic tanks in that area, and so we were able to overlay that. And so you can see that the correlation coefficient between acetaminophen and sucralose is 0.79, which is very, very high, especially when you consider the difference in half-life. So I'm not saying that there is no reclaimed water nutrients, or, of course, there's other sources of nutrients in this water, but that this is the clearest evidence we've seen in any of our studies that there appears to be septic inputs into this water system. So we are doing a couple of other source trackers, but nothing is, we've tested Bacteroides, which is the most common organism in the mammalian gut, but that is really, that's panning out to not be very reliable, because the DNA analysis, it's believed, or it's said to be species specific, so you can look at the difference between different species, but we're seeing a lot of what we believe are false positives as well as false negatives, so I don't think that we're going to continue to kind of add that to our bag of tricks, if you will, as we're trying to figure these things out. But we are adding some other analyses, some of the other chemicals that other people, that including in that DEP slide identified, there's a couple pharmaceuticals that we're going to start looking at, as well as maybe some other excretion things like sterols and things like that. So we're continuing to try to work on that so we can get a better understanding. But certainly acetaminophen and sucralose, no reason to be in the water, and we know that acetaminophen is taken out by sewage treatment. And so this is pretty compelling data. So, again, this is just a brief overview, but I think that we were able to identify, and in a lot of our maps, we do have some, like for things like mercury and lead, there are some very specific points where we see just a couple hotspots of those, so those will be actionable that we can look into and try and find the source of those. But our maps have done, I think, a good job of identifying areas where pollution is accumulating, and we're starting to get at determining the source of the pollution. I think that Dr. Palmer's work is going to help to inform that. And then, obviously, we all work together to figure out how to stop it at its source. And so I'd be happy to answer questions. Yes?
During the course of your study, there's no known sewer leaks or discharges into the Sykes Creek watershed? Is that accurate?
That's a very good point, that's another source of that. I don't know of, I mean, certainly we didn't hear of any, but do you know of any during that?
Several years ago, there was an overflow at a lift station near the Florida Boulevard pond.
Right.
It's sort of in the middle of that study area. That's the only thing that I recall.
But I think that was well before, and so that's the good thing about acetaminophen is it does have a short half-life, so it's not going to be something that's going to stick around.
So I'm trying to, for the layperson and anybody who might listen to this later on TV, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like, when we look at the goal, number 2 goal is determine the source of the pollution. It sounds like you're saying the source of the pollution is septic tanks.
In that particular, so every area is different, but it seems to that would be the analysis of this data, that there has to be some sort of either sewage leakage or septic. It's untreated wastewater. Yes.
So around Kiwanis Park, just north of the 520 bridge that crosses through the middle of the examples that you've shown, toxicity is high, the muck is not quite so high, but there's no, at least I don't see any septic tanks right in that area.
So one thing I didn't mention is, so everything that I talked about as far as the nutrients we're measuring in sediment. The nutrients, the acetaminophen and sucralose is measured in grab water samples because they're very water soluble. They don't settle into the sediment. And so that's, again, because everything has to be much more complex than you would like it to be. That's the issue, is that it's moving water. So these are grab water samples that we're testing sucralose and acetaminophen in. And so it's not as site-specific as the sediment would be, as the nutrients that we're testing, and even that isn't as site-specific because sediment moves, but not nearly as readily as water does. So I think that looking at these maps, I don't think that we can say, you can't pinpoint, here's a leaky septic tank, here's a clean one. And in fact, in the area where it narrows and goes north, you see very high levels of acetamin and sucralose, and those are some of the areas that are not on septic. But there's so much septic input around there that would be putting those chemicals into the water.
Go ahead, Charles.
I would presume that perhaps lateral lines, if they're leaking, could contribute to those levels as well?
I mean, we can't say that for sure. I mean,
I didn't.
Right. Yeah, I think that all that this data tells us is there's untreated wastewater or waste.
So, and for me, I got to look at these color codes, because
Sure, that's
All right.
what, yeah, that's
It's
why.
really helpful. So
Yeah.
if I look at the toxicity, which I'm not sure what that means, but it kind of scares me, particularly because grandkids swim around some of these areas. But if I look at toxicity and I look at nutrient and I look, anyway, down here on the south end, toward Horty Point, about halfway down on the west side, you're showing a lot of muck, high toxicity, and all septic tanks in that area. Where if you move just a little bit north of that, where you don't have any septic tanks, you're not, those same red lines are not there. I mean,
Right, and that's the purpose of these studies, is that we dig in with every interested party and try to now figure out what, like kind of prioritize areas in the maps and say, okay, we got to try to look into this. And so maybe we have to look at our infrastructure of sewage transport, and we have to look at our septic tanks, and we have to look at water flow and all of those types of things to try to track it to its source. It's extraordinarily complex, but that's the purpose of, that's why we do think that the maps are a good way to look at them, so that we can start to identify areas of greatest concern, and then try to figure out the problems and find solutions.
Right up where the barge canal goes into Sykes Creek, which is showing really high muck depth. Okay. Was that an area that also showed other toxicities and things at a higher level? I can't quite read it. Do you remember?
No.
Okay, that's all right.
Can you, I don't know what the...
There's lots of little dots on here, I mean.
Oh, okay.
North of 528.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's certainly an area where we see some of the highest sucralose, and so that's what we have a, I promise I'll give you a multi-page, looking at all of our data and kind of looking at all of these things, how they all relate to one another, because I think that is an important component of this.
And sucralose is runoff.
Sucralose comes from both treated and untreated. Yes.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, and because there's lots of people watching this online right now, probably 4 or 5, and we have lots of people out in the audience here, color-coded maps are great for people's attention and getting them nervous and scaring their grandchildren. However, relative toxicity means the ones that are red are the ones that were the most toxic. It doesn't mean that they're really, really toxic. So be very careful in how you interpret red maps, yellow maps, and green maps, even though we try to use them all the time. It's a scary situation when you see things like this and you think, oh my God, the whole lagoon is red. The numbers are important. And I think probably when Dr. Trefry gets up, he'll probably have a few more numbers on his slides. And people don't like numbers, but they're really important.
Right. But
Thank you, Dr. Windsor.
The red, it's on a scale of 0 to 100, with 100 being the most toxic. So I absolutely agree that there is not, we don't know what's causing that toxicity. So the intent of these is to identify areas that need to be further investigated. And that's why over time, originally we were just putting out the toxicity map. And so that's why we started adding the heavy metals, and why we're so thrilled to be working with Dr. Palmer's group, because it's going to start to inform what these toxicants are. And so absolutely, we have, and we have plenty of data that we will provide, as well as statistical analysis. So it's not, this is certainly not the beginning and end of what we provide. Yes.
So if I was going to kind of distill this down, make it so it's very accessible, it appears that your study and the results indicate that septic tanks are an issue, and which is something that, just kind of promotes what we already know, and that, we need to spend some of a lot of our effort on that, as well as the
in that particular area.
In that area, and that's where the, kind of, use the the monies to go, address those issues, and that the muck is also part of the problem. So you really got to look at it from the source and, or the sources, this muck continues
Right.
to be a source.
Right.
And that the canals in those areas also seem to be, big
Which is a big problem.
contributors.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I didn't mention earlier is grass clippings. And grass clippings, we have found to be a very large contributor to the muck. We believe it is, and all signs indicate it is. And so we have a number of studies where we are doing, similar to what Virginia was talking about earlier, before and after, where we're putting in buffered shorelines and things to keep grass clippings out of the water. And to show the impact of that, as well as, and what we will have in this data set, and it's not quite complete, but will be complete, is we're developing, or in our lab, we're standardizing DNA fingerprint analysis, PCR analysis, to identify turf grass, so St. Augustine grass as well as Bermuda grass. So we can say in these muck, we can overlay a muck map with areas where it's not qualitative or quantitative, it's just presence or absence, but we can say in these particular areas of high muck, we see this particular DNA from St. Augustine grass, and in fact, that canal, all the homes have St. Augustine grass. So that could become an education, or you already have your education initiative, but it certainly could support it as well as direct it to areas where it's most needed.
Courtney?
So, yes.
So, I think with the copper was very interesting to me, and I think it's since a lot of the locations are so close to the shoreline and in canals that maybe the copper-based herbicides might be a
Right, and
possible source for
algicides,
that.
absolutely,
Right.
and even maybe in some of the retention ponds, they could
Oh,
be using
definitely.
that, and they
Yeah.
could be getting into the lagoon.
That's definitely a common
Uh-huh.
water,
Right,
invasive water.
right. I think that's probably,
we,
that's most likely. I mean, we've tracked it back to boat, like the paint from boats, like
Right.
if there's
Okay.
boat, where boats are being sanded and things like that. But I definitely think that would be, I would, especially look in that particular area and look at where copper-containing chemicals are used.
Yeah. And then the only other thing I had was, maybe for Virginia, was I know we have a lot of projects in this general area, and I know that might be interesting to the community, or the 4 people that are watching that might want to know just real quick, what we're doing in this area to address maybe, some.
Right, so we have the Sykes Creek dredging project that was bid out and needed to be rebid, and so we're very close to being able to rebid a small phase of, a first phase of it in this area using the Kiwanis Island for dewatering, and then we're working with Florida Inland Navigation District on their larger dewatering area to be able to complete the rest of the project. But
Okay.
yeah, we expect this to be out to bid in a few months.
And this would be a good time to look at septic tank removal in this particular area.
Yeah, so we have 3 septic to sewer projects out of our first 5 are in the whole county, are in this general Sykes Creek vicinity. The other thing I wanted to add to your point of the takeaway, so we have, the problem is we know we have too much nitrogen and phosphorus in the lagoon, but it's very hard, you can't look at that molecule and know where it came from, what was the source. And so when you can't do it that way, you have to look at other lines of evidence. And so, one of the tools that we have is modeling, using a theoretical approach. Well, if you put this much nutrients into a septic tank, what's probably going to happen to them? And so we have models of how much impact those septic tanks might be having on the water quality. Step 2 was, well, let's install wells, groundwater monitoring wells, so we can see how much nutrients are getting from those septic systems into the groundwater. And we have evidence that the groundwater is moving towards the lagoon, but that's still not proof that this nitrogen came from that septic tank. So this is yet another line of evidence that says when you go to the water and you sample not just the nitrogen and phosphorus and muck in that water, but you look at these anthropogenic sources of artificial sweetener and aspirin, you see evidence that points you towards septic or leaky sewer pipes or reclaimed water
Right.
as the most likely
Right.
large contributor to the problem.
Right.
So we're looking at those multiple lines of evidence to try to determine what our priorities need to be.
And I think that's, like, as an applied research organization, that's what we take more of, like a human health and like a more preponderance of the evidence. Like, when you go to the doctor, it's very hard for them to say this is the absolute. They do a series of tests that tell them what other tests they do, and then
Rule
they
stuff out.
right, and then they try a treatment, and that may not work. So that, but again, we do this to inform what the basic scientists are doing. We don't ever think that that's not. And it's also always informed by that. So it's always, it takes all of it to work together. So we try to fill in that missing piece and not duplicate efforts and certainly not compete with other people's efforts. So, any other questions?
I think, Dr. Fall, so that period that you all did the study on, that there was no significant rain event or anything during that, right?
There was a little bit, I mean, we had some rain days, but there was nothing, I mean, it never stopped
It was
us from
typical,
working.
you
It was a
would
typical, it was
say.
afternoon rains and things like that.
And that time period is typical in the year, and that pollution or the nitrogen that you saw there, you could say was taking place every day throughout the year? Was not just because of a weather event?
Well, so the reason we test in the sediment is we're looking at what's incorporated into the ecosystem. I mean, it's just all so complex. We've tried, in the past, we have done studies where in canals where we've done it seasonally to look at see if that we could see any seasonal effects or tie it to things like weather events. The issue, what we found is, because there's so much muck, that the input from the muck, what's already there, it kind of overwhelms what's adding to it. So it's really hard to really hone in on that question. So, I mean, I think what our work and our data shows is sort of what's happening in a snapshot, but from kind of a macroscopic focus. Does that answer your question?
It does, thank you.
It's kind of complex. It's all kind of complex.
It's really
Every
cool.
day
Thank-
more complex.
It's
Yes.
great. So I'm back looking at this, and I'm looking at the nutrients, and I made a note where you went organic nitrogen. And then I'm looking at the nutrient tracking and where the septic systems are, and I'm looking down on South Tropical.
Okay.
And so you have a whole area where it's blue and green water just south of the airport, which used to be great, but it's not anymore for fishing, because all the grass is gone. But you get down to where the houses are, and all of a sudden, you get this yellow and red spots on both sides, and it just seems to be directly related to wherever population is. Am I drawing too simple of a picture here?
I mean, I think that in general is the issue, is that it's population, it's development. I mean, I think that we all know that. If we were back to not having any of these shorelines developed, things would be great. So I don't think that's a stretch. But again, if you're looking at, I don't know which maps you're looking at, but the sucralose and acetaminophen is water samples. So that, what we grabbed at that moment was flowing by.
Thank
So I'm excited because it's telling me you're going to read the report.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And look at, look at the data and what the data means in relations to the maps. So, good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry. Let's see.
We're going to take a 10-minute break. We will return at 10:20. 10:20.